Welcome to another episode on catalyzing radical systemic change, where it's all about mapping, discovering, and cross-pollinating what I think are the necessary building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. Today, my guest is Nicolas Rotundo, and we're going to speak about large-scale ecosystem restoration. And as a start into our conversation, I'm curious to listen into a couple of the defining moments in your own biography that actually made you who you are, and ultimately also what the difference with the jobs and projects that you're developing. And I want to have you, funky creature, starting giving yourself into the middle of this virtual room, because you always quote yourself having a botanical heart and a mechanical mind. So I'm super curious to listen into that and happy to hand over the mic to you.
First off, I just want to say a really big thank you, Alistair, for just being such a visionary leader, just warmly welcoming and combining and stirring the pot in every single way. It's been such a great piece getting to know you over the last year, and the conversations we have are always so enriching for me as well. So thanks for the opportunity, and looking forward to see how many rabbit holes we can dig up. A mechanical mind and botanical heart has been like really a defining dichotomy in my brain as long as I can remember. Since I was about 6 or 7, I found myself outside playing in nature. I really never had any video games. My mom and dad just pretty much had me outside all the time. And it was mostly through just thoughtful and protracted observations that I was able to interact with my environment. So I was able to see, growing up in Australia, what drought would do through summer months, and how creeks would change, and how animals would like suffer. And I could start to see how insect and bird populations would dwindle during different ebbs and flows of hot and dry seasons. And it was mostly just from doing nothing but paying attention for days, months, years on end, that I was able to learn a lot about really how there is like a holistically integrated system that basically everything depends on everything. And the mechanical part was my dad was a bit of a racer and worked with Snap-on Tools, a large international tool corporation. And I was taking apart engines, clocks, microwaves, very seldom putting them back together, but I could definitely take anything apart for the first little while. And that took me into 2 very, very different kinds of universes, like car racing and motorcycles, and deep into kind of tropical landscaping in some ways. Like we had ferns and water and such pieces. So that's like really been probably the most important chunk to like creating a unique set that I could have a blending and merging of both the technological and the ecological worlds. And if you'd like, I can go into my later years after I was a tiny human, if that's of help as it pertains to my career.
I mean, what you're doing is a very particular niche. And ever since I met you, what really excited me is that you really think big, not big is better, but like bold and daring in the sense of what we need. I think we all agree up to IPCC level is we have large swaths of land that are degraded, not soil erosion, 150 years of artificial fertilizers, the biggest loss of biodiversity on the planet. So we need people that really think landscape level business models. And maybe we stay for a last moment with your biography. Is like what were some of the turning points where you had this, okay, this is where I see fit, this is what I want to dedicate my life to?
Excellent. So coming about professionally, I kind of took on 2 things at the same time. One was controlled environment agriculture as it pertained to growing cannabis. And the other was a mission specialist for the state of California, which was dealing with sensors and computer diagnostic related pieces towards basically pollution. And so really being able to get a huge macro picture as to the most strict standards, which are in California, for trying to mitigate combustion engines, which were a big, deep love of mine. Obviously, burning fuel and getting into racing was like such a fun thing, but also realizing the harmful effects is it's not always as exactly as it seemed. And coming into controlled environment agriculture, I was able to take this unique understanding of sensor data, being able to look at many different inputs that take a very complex system, and then trying to get a desired output of pure efficiency. And so like this kind of concept, when applied to controlling an environment, created like a unique catalyst for a different perspective than most people in the plant world. So I was able to take this to the upper echelons of the degrees. I was able to do things that still to this day haven't really been done. And at some points, it's kind of a little bit crazy when you look at all the different components that come into controlled environment agriculture. But when you start playing the role of God, you actually start to look at the color spectrums of light. You start to look at that as it pertains to latitudes on the planet. You can pressurize a room and mimic altitudes. You can start to play with mycorrhizal fungi, and you start to look at microbiology in your solutions and your soils. You start to look at the aggregate mediums, and you start to look with microscopes at the smallest things on both the leaves and in the substrates that you're growing in. You started looking at the exact carbon dioxide levels. You started raising parts per million of your air and controlling what the plants breathe. You controlled how much oxygen the roots were getting. You started controlling the vast array of nutrients. And that was because you're looking at something that was $4,000 a pound. Now, I thought, like, how messed up is our food system that nobody's paying $4,000 a pound attention to our food systems? And so when I first took this kind of information outside, I realized that the top leading experts that were managing orchards and starting to look at these things had a much narrower view frame. Because they didn't have the time, money, and attention to be able to give these trees this. So all of a sudden, I step outside into my first orchard, and I'm like viewed in some ways like an expert at like being able to see what's going on a larger scale because of my fine, minute attention to details, to all the different inputs that I had control over, where outside you don't. So you just kind of like accept that all these things are happening, and I don't know what's happening. It's probably a fungus, you know, or I don't know, these trees just die. Or like in the case of avocados, they have a very unique kind of setup where like they don't always fruit and flower at the same time. It's kind of, they say it's just random. Even at the top fields, they say, and oftentimes like it doesn't always make sense why parts of the fields fruit and flower and why sometimes they don't, and or why sometimes none of them fruit and flower. And for me, it wasn't so random. For me, it's constantly feedback loops that are able to like start integrating this. So this fast forward just a heartbeat ended up taking me to, when I was pretty young, to a pretty giant scale agroforestry project. It was about 80,000 trees in a year, and with Biofuels International in Fiji. And they were telling me that earthworms weren't living. That was like their lead indicator that they couldn't figure out that things were happening. And I started like saying, like, you've got way bigger problems than earthworms. If you're seeing a freaking arthropod, like a giant, an animal this big, think of how everything smaller than that is probably nuked as well. And I was like, I was so audacious at this time. You know, I'd been doing 100 trees, 200 trees, 500 trees, maybe 1,000 tree kind of orchards that were already planted. I wasn't planting them. I'd plant 100 trees at a time into the fruit world. And I was like, I think I can go into a totally different biome and help this out. And so I got flown out there and did the very first in the entire world that I'm aware of at the time was organic biofuels for perennial agriculture. And what that means is like basically everybody spends the money on these annuals that we're growing corn and we're growing all these species and that these oils that we cut and harvest and till up the soil and use a ton of water. And then we basically do it all again. And we're using machine agriculture. So we're using petrochemical fertilizers, petrochemical pesticides. We're using petrochemicals in the tractors that are tilling these things. So we're growing fuel with fuel to burn fuel. Like, it's like, what are we thinking? And so I was like, we have to be able to do this a different way. And I think the tropics were a great example. And we ended up focusing on this Pongania nut, which was like from Africa, and a super highly resinous oil nut. And imagine a perennial is like a tree. So you plant it, and if you plant it in the tropics where you don't really have to think about it, you just come back and you harvest year after year after year after year after year. And we were looking at the soil, and as I was saying, this was the first globally that was organic. And it's because, why do I care about what I'm putting in the soil for when I'm going to burn it? You only care about organic when you're going to eat it, except we don't realize that a lot of these nitrogens come from post-industrial waste. And so it's literally something that people used to have to pay to throw away. Now we're putting it in our fuel to go and burn it and put it in our soils, and we're wondering why shit's dead. Pardon my language. The big issue in regards to that transition was we did this all organically with locally sourced materials. So we took a $200,000 a year fertilizer bill to $25,000 in local labor, and we had the dankest soil I've ever seen. We were harvesting bat guano from the caves with local tribes people in the Matangali and multiple different tribes at night, sustainably harvesting the bat shit. And then we would take rice hulls from the byproduct of the rice industry, and we would take potash, the byproducts of the sugarcane industry, one of the most polluting things on the planet. And then we would take, they would eat certain kinds of algae and kelps, and we would take the pieces that they didn't use for food. And we would take crushed up oyster shells from Jay Hunter pearls, like the fanciest pearls in the entire world, and all the shells that were so beautiful but wouldn't quite make it on the shelf, he would just give to us. So every material was free, and every single dollar went to a human. And we made the most rich, organic, giant tractorfuls of this organic soil for biofuels. And also we interplanted a bunch of different fruit trees and crops. And so we only used about 6 different species at the time. And this led to like a pretty big deal, because we were the second largest consumer in Fiji of petrochemical fertilizers. And China calls, and I'm literally talking about China. China calls and says, where are you getting your fertilizers from? And we were like, no, we're doing it all on site. There's no way that you're doing that on site. And they're like, yeah, this weird kid from California is deciding to do these things. And they really didn't believe it, because there was this moment here, because there's very few in island nations, you're just buying it from like main sources. And China was the producer of these fertilizers. It wasn't like a company. It was the Ministry of Agriculture. And so I got invited for a consult to the Ministry of Agriculture in Jinan, which is in the Shandong province in the northern part, the most remote part of China. And I had this like moment where I thought that I could change the world, like literally change the world. And I was like, I'm already in over my head. We just did all these trees. We're like, I'm already like thinking I might have just fucked up. I don't think it's actually real if I could do this or not. And I'm in this like very remote part of China with 2 translators, one that's really good with agriculture, a little bit of English, and one that's really great with English. And we're going out to these fields, and I realized how massive the global problem was. As I'm looking at these empty fields, and they took my phone, they didn't let me take any notes. And they were like, we heard you came out to actually solve an earthworm issue, and we're going to show you our soils. And I was looking at all these labs. We went through these giant buildings with like hundreds of people looking at microscopes of soils labs. And you have to think, this Ministry of Agriculture is responsible for feeding over 1 billion people. Like, it's like the most important science in the world is like making sure these humans are fed. And they're showing me this little bits of empty land. And they told me that they had taken shipping containers back from Brazil after deforesting for palm oil and cattle production. It was a lot more palm oil, I guess, at the time. And they were taking the topsoil from the Amazon, putting it in a shipping container so their shipping containers weren't back, because they were like, this is microbiology. We can see how alive the soil is. Dumping it on their fields and carrying out the exact same practices that they were to go and nuke topsoil from the Amazon. And I was like, oh my gosh. So here we are. This is why you're here on the planet. You could die after this if this gets taken on and they decide to take on just a little bit of a concept of change. And I was like, they were like, what would you do here? And I was like, I'd take all your green organic waste from your hillsides that you maintain. I'd take, you're a communist nation. Nobody can do a countrywide composting program better than you. Nobody in the entire world could do countrywide composting like you could. And you could just mandate it. Nobody else can really do it as good as you. And you're going to basically harvest all the waste from all of your products and all your processes from every restaurant that feeds every single person and put them in a pile and fucking turn it over with a fucking tractor. And well, I had 3 days scheduled. This was day 2, and they laughed at me. And the guy who was leading walked away from me, just totally rude, didn't even want to look me in the eye. They gave me a nice ceramic knife set and said, hey, we actually don't need the 3rd day. We think you're crazy. And so there's this moment I was like, oh my gosh, like these people, like, how is it that it is this fucked that it's like, we're destroying it over here and then we're bringing it over here and then destroying it over here. And it's like, there's not an option. And so when I look at a lot of this large scale ecosystem restoration, going back to your original piece, the crux of it for me is that climate security is food security. And it's food for the forest, it's food for the people. And if we can't integrate the humans into the system to take care of these trees, it will not be successful. And we can go into that in a bit. So thanks for letting me come around to one of my favorite pieces.
So thanks a lot, because I mean, if that's not bold and daring to rethink the way composting is done, you know, nationwide, taking China as an example, I really think we need to be able to sense and develop and ultimately also prototype, test, and ultimately deploy on that level. I mean, you know that I come from a gardener's family. Obviously, we always had multiple composts also in our home, in our own garden. You know, every waste is a nutrient in the natural cycle. Besides, maybe, you know, that we were also still using like water toilets at home. You know, it's a big issue in terms of regulation, but let's, you know, skip that rabbit hole unless you have something very, you know, funky to contribute from that. Is I want to, so we were now like ultra large scale. Can you sketch some of the projects that you are involved in, and especially paying attention to those pieces that you sense should need be templatized? Because not all things that can be done in the tropics can be done, you know, in, let's say, center of Europe. So what I'm looking here is, what are the core learnings and what of them can be applied to different bioregions, but also what of the learnings you had in the, let's say, controlled environment, and what the controlled environment can be extrapolated, you know, of these learnings to, let's say, more mainstream organic agriculture or something like that.
Excellent. So, 2 things come up. One is a soft plug of a new organization I'm forming with 2 beautiful women that I look up to dearly, Fernanda Ibarra and Brooke Dashana. And it's called Ripple of Impact. And one of the few major trim tabs for me is redefining ROI and looking at it at a different lens, is what is real wealth and real value. And I think that is one of the keyest trim tabs, and we can come back to that, but I'll talk specifically more along the lines of what I call taking back the planet with the ultimate heist. And this is holistic, ecologically integrated systems thinking. This is basically, we are nature. We are not separate then. And this is realizing that it's both the technological and the ecological, that we need all solutions deployed. We need to be not afraid to mess up. We need to be very experimental and testing multiple grounds and having multiple ABCD tests. And we keep going in one place and we're like, I'm going to do this one solution and focus. But nature's complicated. It's not so simple. Nature's not like, I'm going to try this one thing at a time. Nature's, I'm going to try a million expressions of phenotypes, and we're going to then see what survives. And so in a biomimicry perspective, we need to be on that same level if we want to survive and naturalize to a changing climate. So one thing is really important, and I won't go much into it today, but technological agriculture is going to be mandatory going forward. When I look at controlled environment agriculture, we will not feed this planet with simple annuals outside. Cereal grains are at an all-time terrible grain stores right now, with Ukraine and Russia, 30% of the grains. We need to be thinking of our starches coming from perennials, and they should be coming from the water. And so a lot more of our food needs to be coming from about 9 to 12 degrees as the equatorial belt starts to expand in changing climates. We will be having more and more water, and it will be greener in a wider berth of latitudes. And so thinking along those lines at where this is advancing. And the reason that controlled environment agriculture is also important is because we can think of growing for a climate that's not here yet. With all those different inputs that I was able to control before with a programmable logic controller and variable frequency drives, and taking technology and dialing things into a moment, we can grow for a climate that's not here yet, and not genetically modified, but selectively breed 12 times in a year, where if I'm testing all these things outside, I can only get two maybe expressions of a year, and you're getting different. From spring to fall, it's still different. And so I can have 12 different times in a year to take the best one. I could grow 10,000 plants and try and kill them and take the 2 that survive. And then I could try and kill them by mimicking drought, by mimicking flooding, by mimicking late frosts. I can control that by changing those climates. And so at the very least, for research purposes and for the sake of having genetics that will withstand the changing world, we need the technology no matter what. Whether you enjoy the likelihood of us growing in soil outside under sun, it doesn't matter whether you like it or not. There's no choice, because we cannot naturally select fast enough, as fast as things are changing, without going indoors. The other kind of component that I think is really a significant component with this holistic environment, ecologically integrated systems thinking, is seeing that the waste streams need to become the resources that we utilize in the soil. So thinking of ecosystem restoration or agriculture not separate from how we're dealing with civil scale use of waste streams, which includes sewage, which includes of all organic waste, which includes building materials, and all the black polyethylene plastic. That agricultural plastic is one of the worst pieces of trash. Not only are we creating more trash, but we could utilize the shit we're already throwing away to be able to do that. So all of these things that, if we were to think about waste, water, power, technology, financial instruments, being able to see ourselves with different unique technologies at Web3 or otherwise, looking at what it is we're going to do, everything can be prototyped in the vertical integration of the food system. Because you think about it, it touches every sector. We've got packaging, we've got distribution, we've got electric vehicles that can start to move these things. We've got ways to start seeing ourselves in decentralized and centralized hub centers and starting to look at these integrated approaches. We see waste, we see transport, we see absolutely the consumer end of like retail to your personal at-home kind of component, and how many people touch this system. And unfortunately, the agricultural world is, I think, the key towards ecosystem restoration. And I think blending those two kinds of components, because of the already existing infrastructure, there's already large pieces of land. There's already the understanding of what a nursery is. There's already understanding of what it takes to have this. Instead of building all these things new, there's ability to just slightly expand on these lands, because a lot of these agricultural lands are the degraded lands, are the dilapidated lands, are the things that need reforesting, are the pieces. So it's not like what we think about as humans is like, we're going to do this over here. and not realizing that it's very much directly attached to the livelihood. If you're going to reforest all the cattle farming in the world, you're going to remove the livelihoods of many farmers and you're going to have resistance. Now, if you aid their process by improving their infrastructure and start at their marginal edges and improve their technical prowess and how they integrate animal agriculture or other things into a better space, because we're not going to be able to stop meat being eaten globally. What we can do is have it store more carbon than it's currently doing, and store more carbon than it's actually creating. It's actually a proven fake that's like one of the easiest things to commodify in the carbon world is holistic grazing. And so what at this most recent project that I've been working on, we just got through putting about 10,000 trees, 65 different species in the ground. And we're doing this all including animal agriculture. So I prepared the soil with 400 head of cattle. I actually also brought in savory and people doing the ecological outcome verification, which I really recommend anybody to check out. The leading edge getting beyond carbon is their EOV program, because they're looking at water, biodiversity, and carbon as a way better picture of what is ecosystem health. And so I brought these grassland experts that are cattle people. I brought my reforestation crew, which was OSA Conservation, and want to give them a beautiful plug because they're doing amazing work in the OSA. And the OSA, by the way, is the most biodiverse place on Earth. We're talking 2.5% of the world's biodiversity in such a tiny chunk, more diverse than the Amazon. And this property is such a keystone piece in so many ways, with freshwater and saltwater estuaries. And we're looking at these people that have never talked to each other. These reforestation people who say, oh, forget about the cattle grazers. We're kind of convert all the cattle land. And the savory people who are like, forget these forestry people. They're just trying to take our cattle land and we're storing more carbon than they are. And it's like, they haven't sat at a table together. And I didn't tell either of them that this was going to happen. And everybody was like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing your drone mapping with your ecological engineers and your savory with your grazing plan and your ecological outcome verification and your tree planting at the same time, and volunteers from a freaking turtle program? Like, why would you think of doing that at the same week? And I was like, because watch what happens. Watch the alchemy of just putting the right ingredients in a pot. And these grassland people were sitting there with these forestry people, and they're looking at the grasses and look at these 30 species of grasses. And the reforestation people are like, I didn't know there were 30 species in this grassland. And they were like, yeah, look at this. Like, look at this insect, look at this thing. And they're both biodiversity geeks. They both love biodiversity. And immediately they realized how important what the other person's knowledge is for the success of their program. Who's going to know better that terrain than those cow people to help the forestry people do the best job for putting those trees in? So when I think of like, what is the most important key concept? It's a all-inclusive stakeholder approach. And it's seeing every single point in the system, from the locals to the neighbors, to the poor, to the indigenous, to the rich, to the investors in the US, or Europe, or wherever the Western world that the money is coming from, and looking at their language and the communication tools that are necessary to create a bridge for translation. Because when people ask what my primary role is, it is not what tree to plant where. A lot of times it honestly doesn't matter. To be honest, it really doesn't. Like, the trees are going to work. They do their thing if they plant them right and you make sure there's going to be water. Pretty simple. The thing I do the most is translation. And it's like realizing that the different languages are actually wanting the same thing. They're wanting to know that there's security going forward. They're wanting to know that we're going to be fed. A lot of these people that I'm working for the richest and the poorest people in the world. Because if you think of agriculture, it's the immigrants in the most close neighboring country. In Costa Rica, it's Nicaraguans. In Mexico, it's Guatemalans. In US, it's Mexicans. When you look at in Thailand, it's Burmese and Myanmar. And like Indonesians, it's Malaysians. And it's like, when you go to the next poorest like region of the world, it's those people that are paid the least for giving us all the energy and our only connection to the earth. 99% of most people on the planet, the only time they really know the earth is when they're putting food in their mouth every day. And they don't realize that a lot of times that's built on the hands of borderline slavery. And if we don't see the economic uplift as being the paramount, because if all systems collapse, if all industry collapses, if all financial systems don't mean anything, we're still going to have to move food. So we would better hope that instead of deploying all the most important technologies, hardware, software, ideas, thought to our food systems first, instead of only when it's after the fact and shit hits the fan, we will have a much more resilient and robust system. We will have localized economies that will stand the test of time beyond the crash of a computer or an ecological or geological or meteorological disaster. So it's like, it doesn't matter all those things because we still need to feed humans and make sure they got water.
I totally love listening in. You have such a eloquent, rich way of weaving the tapestry of your mind and heart out there. When I listen into everything I heard so far, I wonder, out of the work that you have been doing, what are those components that we need to templatize to then scale again, not because big is better, but I'm thinking more of, okay, if China said no for the moment, right? What would be joy and
cool little side note, 8-9 years later, they started instituting a giant composting program that's almost countrywide. I'm sure they don't remember my conversation, but I do want to give it up that China's made huge leaps and bounds, more renewable energy than anybody else. Yes, more coal, but also more renewable energy. We give them so much shit, but we need them. We depend on them. So anyways.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to talk shit if it's not accurate.
No, I wonder, since I know you're in Costa Rica, I really wonder, what are the templates that speak for themselves, that serve as Trojan horses to transform, for example, the way the subsidies in agriculture on a level of the European Union are spent, because we're talking about like hundreds of billions. And I know they're only doing this every like a couple of years, and the last, let's say, plan has been, let's say, so not very promising. But when I think about the next plan for the next 5 years, that will be, you know, go through the European Parliament in, I think, 4 years' time. I'm really trying to think with you, you know, where could we influence the people? Who would be, you know, the convenings that we need to organize to make that happen?
Two things. I think one, the second thing I'm going to talk about will be the example of what I believe will be the template that can be replicated. The first thing I think we need is the tools. Two things we need is, before we get to that, is the tools to organize and see ourselves and coordinate and cooperate. And this is some of the stuff that I'm building in the spatial web. And the second thing I want to more focus on is these Jedi printing facilities, and that we need actual physical infrastructure and new forms of education or a trade school that starts to look at what it is to be the diplomats. Because when we have multiple countries having at war, we bring in people to help bring peace. We bring in people to help negotiate the talks and the conversations. We have interagencies that are not communicating in every single country. In fact, they're in conflict because they're competing for resources. And so what we need are these diplomatic type approaches to seeing these multi-stakeholders. And it works anywhere in the world. When I'm in California and we were dealing with the fires and ecological restoration of 800 acres on a place I called the Mushroom Farm, and that I was the director of ag development there. And it's a gorgeous project on the coast just outside of San Francisco. It's not a mushroom farm, but we can speak of that later. But the thing is that we have state parks, CAL FIRE, Resource Conservation District, National Conservation of Resource Services, which is a subsidiary of the USDA, that are not sitting at a table. All of these people are going to come up with the greatest solution. It's having them see each other as not enemies, because when you talk to them separately, everybody's like, Cal Fire is like, state parks won't let us do anything, and this is why the fires happen. And state parks is like, Cal Fire is just wasting its money on this, and that's why it's not happening. And when you actually sit down and realize that, like, it takes human interaction for us to integrate with these systems. These fires happen because humans were taken out of the system. Indigenous people for thousands of years tended these lands by mitigating the fires, by dealing with ladder fuel and being able to clear the advancing fir forest, Douglas firs. And they were like part of the system. Now, when we remove all that, we start to see 100,000 acre burns and these big dryouts. And so when these people all sit at the same table, we realize that we all have the same goals: less damage, mitigating suffering, like not destroying land. They all care about the exact same thing. And at first, the rules are, we recommend you do nothing at all. We let nature regenerate on its own, except for we humans fucked it up. So why do we think, yes, if we waited 1,000 years or 2,000 years, things will start to come back to equilibrium. I promise you, it'll be fine. Or we can realize that we lose if we don't participate, and we can at least have a little bit of help. So this also happened in Costa Rica in a very similar fashion. We had the MNI, which is the Department of Energy, RED, which is like a famous forestry, the Oficina Nacional Forestal, and the Centro for Cambio Clima. So the Center for Climate Change and the Forestry Services and the Department of Energy had never sat at a table together. And the current rule in Costa Rica is you cannot cut secondary forests for anything. And it's all growing up very unhealthy because all the trees are competing for light. And on this project, a couple projects ago, it was 3,000 trees and 160 species. It's the most biodiverse tree planting in one planting that I know of on the planet. It might be the most biodiverse tree planting in one sitting. In 2 weeks, we landed all these trees in the ground. And what is like pretty, with the help of community carbon trees, by the way, check out Jenny, community carbon trees, she's amazing. And so what these people hadn't even sat at a table, and I go into the Center for Climate Change and they're like, why would we talk to the Forestry Service? And I was like, you mean the people that cut trees? You wouldn't, you're the Center for Climate Change and you don't want to talk to the people that cut trees? It's like, and this is at the country level. We're talking, this is at like bureaucratic high level, fucking, they're supposed to be talking to each other. And I was like, take a look at this 700 acres. I want one provisional permit for 3 half-hectare pieces, quarter-acre kind of chunks. And I want to show you what it's like to tend a forest like a garden with our human input. And I was like, we'll see results in 2 or 3 years. And these vines had grown up on top of these trees that were 25 years old, and they'd never seen the daylight. So they'd never fruited or flowered. There'd never been monkeys seen on this property. And we got up in these trees and we climbed up and we removed the vines, and we removed some vines and we cut out a couple of trees that were like competing for light, that were pioneer species to like advance the natural succession of a forest. And in the first month, the tree flowered for the first time. As soon as it had this giant weight lifted off of its back and it wasn't competing for light and it wasn't racing to the sky, it immediately was like, and burst with some flowers. And 1 month later, 2 months down the road of this happening, there's monkeys eating the flower tips off this tree. I thought it was going to take 2 years. And it was like instantly. I mean, you couldn't get any faster of an experience. And I was like, look, gang, like, look, this is a little bit of human interaction and how important it is that we participate and play in this experience. And I'm not saying we can fix everything that we fucked up, but we sure can attend and participate. And so the multi-stakeholder approach for me is getting everybody on the same page so that our policies can support the humans doing the work, because there's so much bullshit in the way that it makes it not even worth to do the things that are like protecting our watersheds and planting trees on water, because there's so many rules around water. And it's like, oh, we can't do that because the amount of permitting is going to take 6 months to a year. And it's like, well, that's not even worth it. And now, so we're moving to seagrasses, which God bless seagrasses and their ability to freaking put carbon in the ground, but they have nothing to do with actually the rain falling on the land, which falls down the mountain, which feeds everything that is important to us. So as we focus on a carbon-based approach, that's like, okay, what's the easiest, most simple way to monetize things? Because there's the path of least resistance, we lose sight of what's actually the holistic system. Who cares if you can monetize it? If we don't have water in our watersheds, that should be the #1 focus of every single thing on first. Because as long as there's water flowing down the rivers, all life will be relatively okay. And if we do not have water in that flowing down rivers, as you see every river, the Colorado River, the Chad Lake, the second largest lake in Africa drying up, every single piece of these things is looking at it from the wrong direction. It's like, we need to plant trees. Can I talk about the African Union Project and the Green Wall in Africa?
Absolutely, I won't stop you. And then after the African Union Green Wall piece that I'm a dash familiar with, I would like to throw in some spice in the hot pot.
I'd love it. Cool. Well, very blessed to be at a very most important table. Another like major tree project that's been really suffering for about 9 years. And the Green Wall in Africa is the largest tree planting project on earth. Like 30 countries are involved. And it's kind of really slowed to a halt. And I'll be participating and advising with that, the director of the project, Dr. Tangam. It's not like to any fault. There's so much when you think of how challenging it is to work with 3 institutions, try 30 countries in every institution, every language, every tribe, every place. Now, we're planting all these trees, but to what benefit of the people? And so when I look at like one of the major problems is like, how do we keep these trees cared for? And we look at 90% mortalities. We're looking at all these trees that are just being planted to die. And that's like acceptable when you go into the scale of millions. But if you're talking a few million trees and you only have 100,000 survive, why didn't you just plant 100,000 trees well? And think about the time, the energy, the water, the humans, and all the pieces in the system. And this is almost every major trees project that I know of on the planet is having huge mortality and not a lot of buy-in of being able to take care of those trees afterwards, because there's no economic incentive for the humans to take care of it. The carbon can only do so much. And I don't think it means more of commodifying more parts of nature. And so a few things that we're looking at is this band across Africa, when all the rivers run vertically. And it was like, hey, take the same trees, the same amount of people, and plant along your watersheds. Plant vertically instead of a giant, like you're gonna just hold off the Sahara advancing. Just plant the watersheds so that the water stays in the system, that the shade reduces the evapotranspiration. The trees survive because there's water next to it. Like guaranteed the trees are gonna survive better than anywhere else you plant. And expand from that. The other concept was like bringing in arid agroforestry and the mix of polyculture systems that can plant the natives interplanted with species that have like high economic incentive. And I was talking about introducing agave as an opportunity for that. The reason being is one, sugar is one of the biggest ecological disasters as far as burning cane, as well as 2, the high diabetes in Africa and a lower glycemic index that is agave. And 3, it's like a high value crop that happens in just a few years, as opposed to looking at stuff that's going to take 10 or 20 years, like a lot of the baobab. The ability to get everybody to all of a sudden want baobab when everybody eats sugar. It's like, why are you focusing on this thing that 0.0001% of the people are choosing to use? And if you had 1,000% more reduction, you would have less than 0.1% of people consuming these things. So like, how is it that we're actually looking at the needs of the people we're going into and satisfying what they need to actually make sure they feed themselves, then interplant all the natives in between? You're guaranteed to be able to do it if we have some of this like integrated agroforestry and agriculture, whether it's animal agriculture or whether it's perennial tree agriculture, or even annual agriculture interplanted in amongst these things in a no-till method. So that's just like what I think is like another good example of what we could do. Thanks for all the airtime. I'm sorry, I'm such a talker, mate.
No. I totally love it, because I just wonder, to those listening in, it has more to do with the typology of the human being that you are. You know, it all sounds so fantastic, and at the same time, I know it's like super down to earth. It's looking at a plot of land, then sensing, you know, what is the most biodiversity rich, encompassing design that includes the people living there, but also creates a livelihood. Um, are there some examples that you can sketch that you have either been involved in or are planning to advise on in Europe, North America, in, let's say, more moderate climates? Because so far the examples I've heard are like from the tropics, or now we talked about like Africa. So yeah, curious if you can sketch a couple of examples that seem a little bit more familiar, maybe to a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you know, listeners.
Absolutely. So when looking at in the Americas and also in Europe, what is our biggest issue is pretty much cereal grains for the most part. It's responsible for feeding a lot of people, and it's actually the big bulk of all the calories. I think it's like 60% of all calories really come from like rice, corn, and wheat, essentially, like the cereal grains and those things. 60% of all calories on the planet, and they're grown more in these temperate zones. And so the biggest thing is, though, we're facing a lot of issues with late frosts that are killing off things. These massive heat waves, like that's going through Europe right now, and through England, that's happening. I want everybody to pay attention that this is really freaking early in July, when we'd be seeing this stuff in August and September, perhaps a bit more into these things that are just like a little bit abnormal, right? And seeing that a lot of these crops are dead in the water before they're harvestable. And so as these things start to become a little bit more unpredictable, we are thinking of 60% of the calories of the world suffering to be able to make sure we meet those needs globally. And so the problem is global in nature, and we must act local. And what we can do locally is to be able to plant well and right what can be maintained with the water available. So in a local, whatever home, whatever farm, whatever it is, and you're to think of oaks, for example. Oak flour is like one of the most oldest traditional foods of indigenous peoples, and has been used for millennia. And it's such a better flour than our regular typical wheat flour for us to eat, as well as like arrowroot and like other native roots that are also able to be ground into flour, that are semi-perennial or perennial roots. And they're actually better for us, and they grow naturally. We're not trying to bring something in. And so thinking of this stack to be able to offset those components and start to grow perennially can happen anywhere in the world. And doing what you and your water sources can handle comfortably, and preparing the soils first so that there's a succession instead of just thinking of planting the trees. It's how do we create the condition for these trees to survive by creating more retention in the soil, by creating more biomass, by creating all these successional stages that'll make the tree survive, instead of just like, I'm going to put a tree in a desert. That's literally what we're doing all across the world right now. It's like, we're like, there's a desert here. There used to be trees. Let's put a tree there. And it's like, why is it dying? It's like, it doesn't make any sense. So also starting at the edges and moving our way out. Where there's already existing beauty and biodiversity and forests and other things, it's how do we work out from those sections? Because like everything will survive at a much higher rate. And so when we can't afford to waste a single drop of sweat or a single drop of water, do it where that ecosystem and that biome and that soil system is going to retain that water and use it the most efficiently and use it the most effectively, instead of pouring it onto like what is some of this hard packed bullshit and pouring the water on and watching it just explode and evaporate back into the area. Like, thanks, we did that. We just gave water back to the hydrological cycle in a not very efficient way. So we need to basically be thinking about how much we can be infiltrating water, how much we can focus on the watersheds. And that's all the temperate regions. It's way more important to be focusing on the watersheds than the tropics. Because here, I tell you what, the water's gushing. But there, that's like the most important thing we can do. Planting the watersheds, planting the forest edges, and kind of interplanting analog or agroforestry, like mixing trees, both natives and food trees, food for the forest.
I think this was a rich tapestry of examples. Let's zoom out a little bit meta. With all the buzzwords in Web3 and blockchain, and you were mentioning the spatial web, where do we need more or can harvest the wisdom of technology and merge it with all these large-scale endeavors?
One of a great mentor of mine and a friend, Arthur Brock, founder of Holochain, and Fernando really speak to currencies as seeing currents, as seeing flows. And when I look at people participating in a system and getting adoption or utility, I don't think that most of our technologies mean a whole lot. They apply to people who already are privileged and have the financial instruments and other things. When I look at the global problem of climate refugees and people moving and coming into our countries and taking our things and stuff and resources and such, it's going to be happening at a rate never before ever known. And so with the idea of as many people being displaced, how is any of these technologies affording access, opportunity, and utility to the bulk of humanity? And so when we're thinking of appealing to the people who will pay for it, as opposed to mitigating the suffering of those who will actually be causing turmoil in our own financial systems, when we have millions of people displaced or running away or war over literally water or food resources, it affects everyone. And so if we don't think about how we're applying some of these technologies to the mass of humanity, we're really missing the boat, because all these ones and zeros that we're watching on the speculative investment scale, which is what 99% of the crypto bullshit that's out there. And when we talk blockchain, when we talk Web3, it's a big pyramid stacking scheme that's just making rich people richer and poor people poorer. And we all promise something new, except for there were tons of millionaires. There were even some billionaires on the huge boom and bust that we've just experienced. And if we had one fucking amazing person that was actually going to follow through and save the world, we would have heard about it. And if there was just one fucking rich, I was going to drop a word that was totally going to have to be edited. If we just had one rich jerk come through, we would have known about it. And so it's like, you say you hate the Wall Street people, but you're still just doing the same thing. And so how is it that we're actually redistributing the wealth and looking at 90% going back into the system? Because if we're creating abundance, it's not abundance if it's not shared. There's no such thing as abundance if it's hoarded. If you're not putting it back into the system, which includes probably converting it back to fiat, which is why it's a waste of both energy, time, and attention and resources to like turn it back in so we can have the utility to see it actually take place. We're really wasting a lot of the most brilliant brain power on the planet right now. And and some of the most brilliant brains are just in speculative investing. They're just like watching ones and zeros. It's like, how is it that we're seeding local economies? And how is it that we're like helping more and more humans to participate in the ecosystems we're playing about. So if a technology doesn't have utility for the mass of humanity, I think it's a waste of time at this point right now. I think we're in a point that it's almost too late, and we're looking at a pretty massive collapse of all different systems. And whether that's like hydrological, whether that's geological, whether that's agricultural, whether that's financial, whether it's crypto-based or whatever the case, we're seeing the crumbling and the fracturing of all this fabric. And so some of the most important technologies that I'm starting to really witness is getting people in tune and the sensing to like what our environments are, and the sensing to who we are, both collectively and as intelligence, and this like social elements and this fabric. Because if we can start to see ourselves when we're like in a state of panic, like a Fitbit is able to start to like mirror back to you when your SpO2 monitor in there, or your oxygen levels indicate cortisol drops, and you're like oxidative stress, or you're like dealing with what's it called? I mean, anxiety too, but a lot of people are having these like vasovagal responses of just like people like passing out all the time, adrenal stress, adrenal fatigue. And it's like going through the roof. If we can start to use these things to bring us back to center and give us a self-awareness of the whole, of ourselves, of the environment, then the feedback loops, I think, are going to start mirroring change. We choose to go to bed earlier. We'll also choose to stop destroying things. If we can have some of these feedback systems be able to feed us back this information, so we see Mother Nature's lungs as our lungs. We see her circulatory system as our circulatory system. We see her filters as our filters. We realize that we're not separate. And that's that holistic, ecologically integrated systems thinking. And this is where technologies, I think, are able to take large caches of information. AI can organize it and start to redefine it. And then these cool gaming kinds of components can start to visualize this and start to showcase data in a way that actually means something to me. Because when you or I look at a graph on a sheet, I don't get excited. I don't get sad. I see it decline, but I'm like, what picture am I looking at? And when I start to see it in a new way and I start to relate to this data in a better way, and I don't think that means that we commodify it. I don't think that it means that we monetize it. I think it's literally, as we know, just like the feedback of a stoplight is going to tell us like what we should be doing. We're going to like respond and realize that this is a social norm of how we can participate cooperatively, collectively, and intelligibly.
I want you to elaborate on ripple of impact. Why are you doing it before you start your funky avalanche and tapestry of words? Why ripple of impact? Why do you think that within the projects and the ecosystems you're involved in, it's so important to talk about dry things such as impact metrics and redefining how impact metrics are measured? So yeah, really just curious to listen in, but maybe you can start when you had like recognitions of why that really matters.
I realized, I think it was the biggest piece missing is holistic context, is understanding how much of part of a whole we all are. And I think when you feel like there's nothing you can do about it, that it's actually going to limit your ability to actually enact change, and realizing that some of these things mostly is because we don't understand how much next to the different systems are. Such as when I looked at, I was a psych major in college for a period of time, and I really understood that was brand new information, that a lot of those hormones and drugs that are created, that the dopamine and serotonin and pieces are made in our gut. How can we not think that our food system is affecting that? How come we're not dealing with diet and nutrition when we think of psychology? And this is just in one human body, let alone understanding like how all these systems are relating to one another. It's not just the circulatory. And what science has done is taken, and the root of science is schism, it's to cut, it's to separate every single thing out. And now our head's not even attached to our bellies, which is where these drugs are made to keep our brain juices rolling and keep us happy. And so we can't even think of that on an environmental scale or a civil scale. And we think about how cities operate, and we don't realize how everything has a cascading effect. And so what I really believe as one of the most important kind of trim tabs that we can imagine is looking at how we can come back to tying all the pieces together. And tying all those pieces together can start to look like magic. It can start to be awe-inspiring. It can be starting to drive passion. And when you're coming from a place of passion, there's drive and there's duty and there's courage. There's ability to be bold. When you're coming from a place of fear, you're going to rely on what it is like, just tell me what I need to do. And you say carbon's the issue, I'm going to jump into carbon. And so then we're having teak plantations being planted to the tune of tens of millions of hectares with allelopathic leaves, which means the leaf litter means nothing can live under it. We're creating food deserts and barren wastelands as we're storing carbon for hardwoods. And the teak market is just crashed drastically because we have a ton of just shitty teak that's not the same as it once was. And so we have all these unintended consequences as we jump in. And it's because there's not what it is for holistic systems thinking. And so what I would love people to do is fall in love with their participation. And this is what Fernanda and Brooke and I have started to devise in Ripple of Impact, is starting to look at what both experience design and a more focused and integrated approach of listening to people's desire of theory of change and starting to let them actually connect with it on a more holistic principles and scales, which allows them to not just connect to the earth, but it also allows them to connect to themselves and each other. And realizing that we are not separate from any of these systems, it starts to feel a lot more hopeful than hopeless. And most people operating from the fear-based are making these poor decisions that are either just purely financial driven, or even if it's just altruistic and just planting a bunch of trees, it's wasting all the money and energy. Think of the carbon market right now. That's a $500 billion market, $500 billion. That's enough good that we could have solved water issues around the world. We could have had water everywhere. We could have had rivers flowing by now. This is 20 years in the making. And we have $500 billion sitting in bullshit. And we've lost our freaking minds in some ways. And so it's not about, I can't plant enough trees. I can plant enough trees for you and me and our travel and our flights that we take. I can definitely do that. That's not a problem. But I cannot solve the system if I don't get the biggest people to believe that it isn't about 1% returns, 3% returns, 10% returns. We need to get comfortable with a negative IRR. We need to get comfortable with a negative return on investment and realize that the real wealth is generated from the legacy that we will make from actually understanding how much the ripple of impact of the positive decisions we make is an actual investment and not just philanthropy. And it is an investment into the future that everybody sees returns on. And we can bank on those futures because we will be fed and we won't be thirsty. So that's how I feel.
We both can't look into the future, right? We don't know. Total collapse, a little bit of collapse, maybe the systems uphold for a dash longer collectively. But what we both know is we are co-creating the future. So when you imagine your involvement, your expertise, your networks, with all the projects that you're immersed in, as well as finding the right allies, what would be a daringly positive outlook in the next decades ahead? Notwithstanding that things will get messy, but what and also I don't want it to be romanticized, more in the sense of, you know, 20, 30 years ago, nobody would have thought that like so many renewable energy would exist, just 20 years back. So when we look into like 20 years into the regenerative paradigm and still degrading soil and problems and the Amazon and plastic waste, you know, I think it will all be simultaneously. But when we look at like all the seedlings and the sproutlings in our ecosystems, and we see them really interlocking, cross-pollinating, unlocking massive amounts of capital, what do you see happening?
The world is advancing technologically all across poor countries, indigenous places, in indigenous communities. We're seeing smartphones. I mean, you're seeing technology. You're even seeing renewable energy powering beautiful water pumps that are pumping new wells. Technology is happening everywhere. And it's not happening very responsibly because it's not understanding that we need to not just create less waste, but use less materials. And so there was a really interesting conversations that we had at Emerge with Daniel Schmachtenberg and Nate Huddins, and just speaking to the tune that we're not doing this without fossil fuels. And we don't have the materials to shift to a renewable economy right away. We don't have the silica, we don't have the chipsets. You see all kinds of supply chains bottlenecking right now, from vehicles to everything. And that's like, we can't even see a 10% increase in production value. We can't, it just doesn't exist. We don't have the mining capacity for the lithium, the cobalt, the neodymium for the magnetos in regards to the wind turbines. Like, we just don't have the materials right now to do this. And so what we have to be is strategic and efficient. And what I think is really missing is we're powering industry and manufacturing, and we're putting these things on these big office buildings that are dinosaurs dead walking. We're putting all this like renewable energy on these manufacturing plants that is like, just literally, we're going to stop producing shit. We're going to stop consuming as much. Like, we are going to, because there's no option. There won't be money to buy crap. And so all these things are getting these things to get, I'm going to continue producing crap. However, all of these resources, I believe, should be tied into bioregional hubs for agricultural economies. And I think that we could take examples at the 100,000 to 300,000 person scale, and not only have really great sample data to be able to look at quality of life and metrics as far as happiness, but we could start to look at what it is to boost these individual, and these are poor rural economies, and I can tell you exactly where I would do it. It's in places what I think is the trim and the least amount of resistance. If I were to try this in a city, think of all the bureaucracy. If I were to try this on the Yucatan, let's say, think of all the corruption and the cartel and all the people that you have to pay. When I look at the poorest regions of Mexico, it's also the most biodiverse. That's Oaxaca Centro. And I also look at agricultural, ecological, and cultural significance, where they're still connected to their prayers, where they're still connected to the land. Nobody's going to fight you if you're wanting to improve their watershed and their water systems. Nobody's going to fight you if you're trying to take on their trash systems. Nobody's going to try and fight you if you're going to improve their distribution and their seeing of the agricultural system and what's producing where and how and who. Nobody's going to fight you. And if I pick any of these other places that we are investing money into, there's all this resistance that's slowing the hurdles down. And these communities, one, they don't deserve what's happening to them first. Two, they're responsible for feeding often 10x the amount of people that are there. So if it's 100,000 people, they're responsible for feeding millions. And so the ability to make and focus in these poor communities first is what I imagine a fund that will take care of all people. And that's the future that we really are going towards. It's like, it is not just the funds for the rich, the foundations for the poor. We have to imagine something that's going to take care of it for us all, and seeing us all as being prey to the ramifications of our poorly placed bets on these dying systems. and really invest in the things that it doesn't matter whether we fail a little bit or fail a lot of it. If our food economies are supported through better water strategies and we have water in the systems that are going to grow food, we're going to make it through the little bit or the good bits or the bad bits or the worst bit. We're fucking, oh shit, all hell breaks loose, the worst thing you could imagine. And we're still going to be grateful that we put all of our resources into the food value chain.
Nicolas, I would say we stop here for the moment being. The dogs are starting to bark. I think this was a very rich, very inspiring tapestry. And yeah, thanks so much for your time, Nicolas.
My pleasure. It's super great. Thank you, Alistair.